All right. Thank you, Kenny. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. I'm excited to share our work expanding the bogs of North Alabama with you. It is a project that has been rolling for about a decade now, but in the last couple years, we've had some wonderful help from the International Carnivorous Plant Society that has allowed us to really expand the scope of our efforts. So I appreciate that as well as this opportunity. So for today's talk, I'll give you a brief introduction of the work we do at the Davis Arboretum, where I'm employed, and then we'll talk about the cultivating of pitcher plants ex situ that we do at the Arboretum, and then conservation of pitcher plants in situ out in the wilds of North Alabama. So the Donald D. Davis Arboretum is located on the main campus of Auburn University. We are inside the College of Science and Mathematics, Department of Biological Sciences, under their collections umbrella, which includes the Freeman Herbarium and the Auburn University Museum of Natural History. The Davis Arboretum is a collection of woody plants of Alabama, but since we are restricted to just 16 acres, our tree collection is fairly well complete because we've had 60 years to put it together. And so, in the time since then, we've done things like refining our plant collections to gain accreditations. Our deciduous azalea collection is accredited by the Association of the Public Gardens of America's Plant Collection Network, and so is our oak collection. And so we have over 1,000 types of plants, which far exceeds the number of native trees in Alabama. And a lot of that is made up of cultivars of deciduous azaleas and cultivars of various herbaceous plants, including pitcher plants. And so that allows us to have 5,000 individually tracked plant accessions, which in some cases will simply be a cultivar that we have in multiple places within the garden, or with some species like the Alabama azalea, Rhododendron alabamense, we'll have numerous accessions of that species with maternal line tracking and source information on where the plants were collected that we maintain in our database. And so we do lots of things at the Arboretum. We do education, and I thought this crowd might appreciate our pitcher plant dissecting program here. And this is something we can do through the winter when there's not a lot of other things for these kids to get out and enjoy. And it's also a time in the Arboretum when it's not baking hot. So we have very little indoor facilities. So it's not a lot going on during the summer, usually when it's potentially 100-degree heat index like we have today. So we do habitat displays as well. And they usually are densely packed with native species that represent something you might find in the wild. In other places, we have all of the species crammed in together with their associate species for things like these pitcher plants that require such specific soil conditions. And then we do taxonomic collections, like the genus Quercus is one of our main collections, and that's because Alabama has such a high diversity of oaks. And so the heat map on the left from BONAP shows you the range of overlap in species going from 0 in white to 28 in that dark blue. And so you can see right there in Southwest Alabama is the center of oak diversity for the entire United States. And it follows that the large tree species are also most diverse in Alabama. And so, in the central parts of the US and the Northwest, you could have as few as 5 species of trees, where in Alabama, we can have 28 species of oaks in a single county. So, in addition to oaks, we have the highest density of hickories and magnolias, and maples are not far off with their heart of diversity being further up in the Smokies in Tennessee and North Carolina. We are also number one for extinctions in the continental US. So we do conservation. We do it in situ in the garden and ex situ in the field. And we try to always maintain a scientific angle on that. Remember, we are in the College of Science and Mathematics. We're not in the horticulture department and we're not in the forestry department, even though those classes and departments do utilize us heavily. We are in the business of science, and conservation biology is a major part of the Department of Biological Sciences mission. So when we do our work, we'll do things like flower counts, where we measure the number of flowers these plants are putting out in the sun versus in the shade. And that allows us to track the success or failure of our conservation efforts in the field. And so on the right, you can see under canopy, the Clematis socialis, the Alabama leather flower, produces very few flowers per square meter. In the sun, it produces quite a few. And so with these rare plants, encouraging reproduction is one of our main goals to increase populations in the wild. And in Alabama, as you saw on the previous map, we grow trees very well. So well, in fact, that conservation in Alabama often includes removing trees just so that our rarest plants can flower and reproduce. The removal of natural fire regimes from the habitat is one of the main causes for loss of these species. And the interruption of that fire regime is through the installation of roads, but also through the campaigns of Smokey the Bear, and honestly, just landowners wanting to protect their resources, mostly through structures. Once they understand that getting fire on the ground actually protects the native ecosystem, many landowners are amenable to working with us. And this news didn't even exist when I started working at the Arboretum. We knew that we had a good bit of plants, but we didn't realize that if you compared Alabama to its neighboring states, that it really jumped out head and shoulders above the rest. It was in 2002 that NatureServe published this report on ranking America's biodiversity, where we saw that Alabama was actually fifth in diversity at that time for total species count. We're now number four. We have bumped New Mexico, and we have our sights on Arizona to displace soon. And once we have done that, then you can see that we would be up against states like California and Texas, which have tremendous land area. And so to be such a small state with so much diversity is a blessing and a challenge. I won't call it a curse. But if you look all the way to the right, you can see that Alabama shows up right there at the top for number two in extinctions after Hawaii. That's largely because of wetland challenges to the snails and mussel species, as well as freshwater fish that have been lost through the damming of our many rivers in the state. The Arboretum that I work in is situated, as I said, in the middle of the main campus of the university. We are on College Street with the President's House adjacent to us, and we are within an easy walk for all of the students that attend the university, which is also a blessing. But we are one of the smallest arboretums in the country. And because of that, we are able to really focus our efforts to make every square foot as valuable as possible. And you'll notice the map on the left is the geologic state of Alabama, or a geologic map of the state of Alabama. And on the right is the shape of the Arboretum. And so if you go to the southwest corner of Alabama or the Arboretum, you'll see sand dunes and all the species associated with them. And if you go to the northeast corner of Alabama or the Arboretum, you would find plants from the Coosa Valley Prairie and the mountains associated with it. So just a flashback to the conservation that we do, that is mostly handled through the Alabama Plant Conservation Alliance, and it is seated at the Arboretum. I'm the coordinator of the Alabama Plant Conservation Alliance, and these are some of our coordinating partners. It's a wonderful opportunity to get these people together that are working with rare plants and have an open forum where we can make sure that we're not reproducing each other's work in unnecessary ways and make sure that no species are falling through the cracks while we're doing our work. And if you look to the far right, you see private landowners, private landowners, private landowners, because here in Alabama, only 4% of our land is held publicly. So that means 96% of the opportunities to work with these plants is in the hands of private landowners. So we do try to do a lot of education around the state and try to make people understand the value of the biodiversity that we have here. And if you look close to the center, you'll see Alpha Phi Omega, which is a service fraternity, has a Delta chapter here at the university that is a key part of the effort in our bogs in North Alabama. And immediately to the right of that, you'll see the ICPS logo with those Venus flytraps, because again, the support from the ICPS has allowed us to greatly expand our efforts working with Sarracenia. So, what does a project for the Alabama Plant Conservation Alliance look like? Well, there are numerous tasks associated with it. So, habitat modeling has become one of our strongest tools now. It's allowed us to discover new populations of many of the species that we work with. Uh, we do plant surveys to ground truth those models and to evaluate existing populations we know of. Mapping, seed collection, propagation. You can see the list goes on and on and on and on. And it's really whatever that plant needs. We work with over 30 species, and every plant needs something a little different. There's a lot of overlap, but the nuances are many. And so integrated plant conservation is what we're trying to do here. And so that's tying together the in situ work in the natural habitat, making sure that these plants don't rely solely on the public gardens to be where they exist, and the ex situ work where we do take them out of the wild and we seed bank them, we hold them in living collections, we learn about the horticulture, we teach others, and we research how these plants grow. And it's really essential to have both of these pieces working in tandem. As we know, there is change in the environment all the time, as there has been for the entire history of these plants. So providing the in situ conservation allows for these plants to continue moving through time, evolving through natural recruitment and selection in a way that we can't recreate in our living collections. And so conservation horticulture is an emerging and newly recognized field. It's been just in the last decade, I've started seeing conservation horticulture job listings where people are getting hired specifically to apply these skills. And so the definition and bullets you see above were provided by Jim Afotler, who helped oversee the creation of the Georgia Plant Conservation Alliance in Georgia. And they are basically our big sister organization that invited us over, showed us how to do this work, and encouraged us to create the Alabama Plant Conservation Alliance to accomplish the same types of things that they were doing in Georgia. And it has been a wonderful experience to get all of these conservation professionals together in a room, looking each other in the eye and understanding that we all want to work towards the same goals, and allows for a lot of accomplishments to get these, genetically diverse populations in the wild established and reinforced through the work that we do. Now, just in case there's anybody in the room who doesn't know where the pitcher plants live, here's a heat map you may have seen before, where the overlapping number of pitcher plant species you can see are highest in the panhandle of Florida, South Alabama, Southwest Georgia, and Southeast Mississippi. Oh, and we'll give the Carolinas and coastal Georgia their credit over there too. But what you'll also see is some gratuitous blue splotches spreading through North Alabama. And so the two blips in the center of the state are the canebrake pitcher plant in the two counties where it grows there. And then in the northeast corner of the state, the green pitcher plant that we'll be talking more about later. We'll be talking more about both of them. There really is a wide spectrum of bogs in and around Alabama. On the left, see Dr. Jenny Cruz Sanders photographing the Alabama canebrake pitcher plant, Sarracenia alabamensis in situ, in a gravelly slope, which is very different from any other habitat that I've seen pitcher plants growing in. I mean, it is mixed with some sand, but you literally see gravel on top of the ground on these hillside seeps where these plants are growing. And then to the right, you've got the Sarracenia minor oaky giant standing there in standing water. And so this is the hooded pitcher plant that is typically small but can grow to very large sizes in the Okefenokee Swamp in Georgia. And so Dr. Debbie Folkert's photographing them. But just a endless amount of fascination that can be found when you start following these plants. But we're best known for the coastal bogs where the diversity is really just off the charts. You can see numerous wildflower species, insects interacting with them as both pollinators and prey, of course. And these are in Conecuh National Forest in South Alabama, where you can see these species growing together. Sarracenia flava on the right, leucophila on the left, and then in the foreground, the naturally occurring hybrid of the two, morii. And it is, as I said, endlessly fascinating once you start delving into these things. But as I mentioned earlier, fire was an important part of maintaining these ecosystems. And so these frequent low intensity fires were common across most of the southeastern US. And you can see the burned rhizome on the right with numerous leaves flushing back out after a burn. It does not bother these plants if you burn in the proper conditions. It is possible to try to burn on too dry of a day when that sphagnum can burn off and you can really do some damage to the plants if you're not careful. But fortunately, the professionals that I work with are informed and aware and work to manage, particularly for these species and most of the sites that we're burning. All right, let's hop down to our second bullet now, cultivating pitcher plants ex situ. So we'll show you some of these bogs that we have at the Arboretum, focusing on our coastal bog, and then just a quick glance at some of the safeguarding and rearing beds we use to accomplish our goals. At the Arboretum, we have mountain bog displays from North Alabama, the Fall Line Hills, and the coastal bogs represented. So the coastal bog exhibit is crammed full of wonderful species from throughout the Southeast. You can see the calopogons blooming there and the black Nicolon hat pins with their wonderful white buttons that we associate with pitcher plants in the wild. And even Zenobia there from North Carolina grows with the Sarracenia flava. So the first thing we did was we picked a sunny spot right by our shed. Then we got some supplies, 1,000 gallons of rainwater to be continuously released onto a 30 by 50-foot plastic liner with 20 yards of sand on top, a dozen bales of milled peat moss that we mixed 2-to-1 with the peat and sand to get 6 inches of media on top of the 1 foot of sand. And so water, of course, is most important. On those gravelly slopes or in the channels of the Okefenokee, water is the factor that ties them together. And so we guttered that shed and built an addition that also delivers rainwater to our cisterns. There's this one and then another 1,300-gallon cistern in the ground nearby. So then we shaped up that bog so that the water would move slowly through the exhibit. We have a 3% grade across the slope of the entire exhibit. And if you look straight ahead, you can see kind of a ridge that allows the water, once put in on what is the closest right-hand corner in this photo, to flow downslope, turn in kind of a horseshoe pattern, and then flow back to exit on the lower left corner. And so here you can see that center ridge and the drop accentuated by the sand that we're adding to the exhibit. So foot of sand below, and then the peat sand mix. So two 5-gallon buckets of peat and one 5-gallon bucket of sand just being continuously dumped into that mixer. And then it just churns out wheelbarrow after wheelbarrow full of the top dressing for our bog. And one of the student workers will run around the corner and dump it on top while the next wheelbarrow is getting full. And it was just a wheelbarrow rally that took a couple days, but it was very successful. The water delivery system is just gravity-fed rainwater, and we have a soaker hose fed through that perforated drain tile, and there's a valve at the end that we can take off of the soaker hose and flood the bog if the evaporation rate or heat stress surpasses the delivery ability of that soaker hose. So this is a technique we learned from our mentors at the Georgia Plant Conservation Alliance. They recommended dancing in the bog. And so, as you can imagine, the flat layer of sand with a flat layer of peat on top of it really didn't mix very well. So, if you get some students that can play some bluegrass and you get some kids that like to get dirty right there at the same time, and you turn on a sprinkler, then they'll just jump up and down and they'll help integrate those two soil surfaces. And so that's what we wanted, mixing of the peat and the sand. And there's definitely still a 6-inch layer on the top, but much more hospitable to root extension into the sand if you do this mixing. Next, you got to get some plants. So went to the, and I'll back this up and say that it was meeting where employees at the Atlanta Botanical Gardens encouraged us to build this bog and said they would help. And that included the offering of plants. So seeing their bog was a huge inspiration for us. And then being able to go shop at ABG's greenhouse was thrill of a lifetime, to be sure. So there's Ron Dieterman loading up flats for Arboretum Director D. Smith. And then we planted them out, got some associate species from down in South Alabama, built an outdoor classroom where people can come and enjoy it, and then just let it cook for a decade, and now it's doing quite well. So in addition to having these display bogs ex situ, we also raise seedlings to share with other gardens, to outplant into the wild, and to fill safeguarding beds at our garden and others. And so seed banking is another practice that we do where we take detailed information on different maternal lines out in the field and collect those. They're also stored at the Atlanta Botanical Gardens. There's Noah Yan with Emily Coffey and Ron Dieterman again, out collecting seeds to be stored at the seed bank at Atlanta Botanical Gardens, Center for Southeastern Biodiversity. So in addition to seed banking, we also want these plants to be alive out on the ground so they can suffer some of the selection pressures of our natural environment, even if it is in a controlled setting. And so the construction of these beds is fairly simple. One of the things that has increased survivability is running all the irrigation underground to make sure that water doesn't get heated up as it's delivered to these safeguarding beds. And once they're established, if you connect them with rainwater, they really only require weeding. And to they only require weeding to stay alive and healthy, but they need to be well labeled, and to maintain that genetic diversity, we do deflower these safeguarding beds every year. So each bed will represent a different genet in the wild, or in some cases, an entire population. And then to prevent that genetic pollution, we do remove the flowers every year. And in addition to the albumensis work, we're now getting to our oreophila work, where we also grow seedlings. And then where we have been able to take them out and put them back on public lands and establish hundreds of these wild plants in situations where the populations had extremely decreased. And so the seedlings are nice, but on some of these state lands, we're able to actually build these rearing beds, and the seeds never leave the property. So we can collect the seeds, take them to these rearing beds. We actually sow them out in the greenhouse, get them head started, and then plant the seedlings in these raised beds. So then when they grow up, we can be out planting large individuals into the field, like those you see Sarah carrying on the left. Okay, so now let's get to the topic du jour, expanding the bogs of North Alabama. So we'll first look at our work on public lands and then look at some of the things we've done on private lands. All right, so to repetition here, driving the point home, this in situ conservation is caring for the plants in the situation where they naturally occur. And pitcher plants have lost a lot of their habitat to development and to habitat alteration. And so just the way that the hydrology changes at these sites through the installation of roads and the division of these naturally slow seeping subsurface water systems, even if the land is set aside, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to stay healthy. It requires on-site management. And if the management is done properly, it can really be a beautiful thing. And so these outplantings in the wild aren't always successful, but when they are, it can be really fun. And so I usually try to pick a signal tree in the background so you can see that longleaf pine coming up in the center of both of those photos. And you can see how those Sarracenia albumensis looked 2 years after planting, I think, and then about 10 years after planting on the right. So yeah, here we go. So on the left, just planted, 2-year-olds doing well. And then we're back in 2019 looking at these. And some of those, and these are just bare root plants with a rhizome the size of your finger. And some of them are expanding into these larger donuts, and others of them have stayed tight clusters, even side by side. It's really interesting how these things react differently. We do have recruitment at this site, so it's pretty exciting work, and this is on private land, as are all but one of the canebrake pitcher plants. And so these landowners allow us to come and monitor these plants in the wild, doing flower counts, plant size measurements, and evaluating just which ones are still there, and trying to help them while we're out there. So again, you can see that forked signal tree on the right. You can't see the pine in the middle because it's totally obscured by inkberry and all the other things growing in. But after a day of manually cutting and dragging, you get some light on the ground, which will hopefully help flower and produce more individuals. Same thing here, just thinning these woods so all those pitcher plants on the right can hopefully expand to that new cleared area on the left. This is done with a team of students from Auburn University, Montgomery. And cutting and dragging is, a ton of fun in the Alabama heat, but heat is really the easiest way to accomplish this. And so this controlled burn, backing up the hill, is a wonderful way to get the heat on the ground, get that herbaceous cover cleared away, reduce woody encroachment, and allow these plants to thrive. And because we partner with a lot of really wonderful organizations, sometimes we get to employ some exciting things. So this drone, you can see in the belly of it there has all those little balls, which are full of a very burnable substance, and they will come out into the little hopper, get ignited, and then we can send that drone out over a field, and it'll drop on a pre-programmed grid pattern, a flaming ball every 3 meters. And so it's another good way to get fire on some of these thicker bogs that we're trying to get back into. Okay, so back to oreophila. It's a gorgeous plant. One of the populations we work in, we see these really dark purple throats, and it's one that in many situations you'll see the phyllodia on the plants, as you can see on the bottom left there, even through the winter. So these are the heroes, the volunteeros, the Alpha Phi Omega service fraternity. And so they really are making space for these plants, and the perseverance and the camaraderie are what set these guys apart, guys and girls, and make that inclusive. So these folks have been volunteering at the Arboretum for more than a decade, and even if there's only, 3 of them that show up one week and we put in 3 or 4 hours of work, over 10 years, that has added up to thousands of hours of work that they've put in at the Arboretum. And then they graduate and move on, but we're all still friends. And so we stay in touch. This opportunity came up. I asked if they wanted to help, and they have taken the ball and ran with it. And now one of the former presidents of Alpha Phi Omega basically oversees the project that the ICPS is funding in North Alabama. And it's that guy on the right with the green glove on waving, Gus Kirby. He is an inspiration to us all. And immediately to his left, his wife, Lucy. And this work does require a lot of equipment, a lot of training, and a lot of personal protective gear. So it's not something to be undertaken lightly. And, when we get a grant through the Alabama Plant Conservation Alliance, we can buy a piece of equipment here and a piece of equipment there. And so it has added up to where we now have the tools necessary to do this work and put the fire on the ground, working with our state partners. And some of these places need it really bad. So that's one of my student workers up there on top of those sweet gums. And, private spots have been abandoned for decades without work. So when we get in and we start clearing, there's some serious work to be done. So let's look at our public lands. They are in DeKalb County, not in the ones that I know of. And I think I'm informed on it. So if there were others, I think I would know. And so preserves like the nature conservancies are considered still private lands because it is a private entity. So here was the first time I visited the State Lands Bog in 2015 in DeKalb County. And as you can see, there's a lot of woody material sprouting and cinnamon ferns. And they've been cutting back the woodies at this point. And so it's still almost a closed canopy, but they maintain the site, and they just didn't have the energy to do it to the level they wanted. And the orange flagging you see on the trees are trees that we recommended removing. And then after a couple of years of removing trees, the grasses started moving in. So that was a real pleasure to see the habitat actually change. And we were able to get the first Section 6 grant in the state of Alabama. There was a couple other species, but the first set of grants included this habitat improvement grant through the Endangered Species Act for green pitcher plant. So this started back in 2019. And that was about halfway through this prescription that had been given to this bog to remove 10 years worth of work, removing 10 trees per year. So what you see laying there is our 10th year of work and the 10th tree to hit the ground. And so we're keeping pines because they help drop fuel and provide some shade. But then the oaks and maples are our primary targets for removal because they dry up so much of the adjacent land and have such high water demands. By removing them allows the bog to expand out into the adjacent woodlands. And so here you can see about year 5, and the pitcher plants are doing better, still quite a few trees. And this is about when we got that grant to start removing more material and get a couple chainsaws. And so this is the same spot. I think it's 3 years apart. So the plants have responded very well. Um, this will be about 7 years after we started coming in and cutting. So the seedling recruitment was documented in just the first couple years. So we're to the point now where the seedlings that have recruited are mature and flowering, and the population is really expanding. And then there are some areas where there were no pitcher plants, but suitable habitat and associate species. And so we made a hole in the canopy, piled it up with the help of some Boy Scouts, and burned it down. Got a few hundred plants, washed the roots, weighed them, and did a survivability study evaluating percent sun and size class to see which affected survival most. And the reason that we have to do this is to write a grant to do this type of work, you really need some scientific backing, published paper where you can reference this type of work. So even though the results were expected, it's worthwhile to have something in the Federal Register that was submitted. And that's that final report that you saw earlier. And you probably won't be surprised that the more sun the plants had, the better they thrived. The larger the size class of installation, the better they thrived. And that's one of the reasons that we were able to utilize the plants from rearing beds for outplantings instead of going with single year seedlings. It was the information that we had to help our success. And so to expand the areas that we can allow these plants to grow in, we have to cut new fire breaks. And so this is this year's work effort with the volunteers. So cutting a new fire break through the woods, and the purpose of that is so that you can put fire on the side of the path that you want fire to be on. So you can see the interior there is thick with underbrush and leaf litter, and so burning that off allows the grasses to move in, which allows the fire to move through. And we're getting some dieback on the oaks and maples out in the area between the bogs. And so hoping that these bogs will eventually, instead of being tiny little postage stamps, will connect up into a larger area. So this year we did our first river scour planting. And so this is where a population of plants had been, but dwindled down to just a handful. And we were able to get seed material from the same property very nearby and put some plants back in the ground to help bolster this existing small population. Okay, so let's look at our work on private property, which, as I said, is 96% of the land in Alabama. And so here, a landowner mowed the area along the creek, saw some strange plants, knew a plant guy, and word eventually got to us, and went down there, surveyed the property, verified the plants, and now I think probably 6 years of work on this site. And we've opened it up. The plants have responded well. This is this year's burn, done in early spring, again with that funding assistance from the ICPS. There's our Alpha Phi Omega team. And it is a safe bet that when the property owner built that lake, it flooded out a nice, wide, open, flat, moist bog that could have been full of Sarracenia oreophila. So in Cherokee County, there's some plants quite close to the Coosa River, and this is a single residential lot in a neighborhood that has a conservation easement, and it is just the size of a house lot, but it is crammed full of pitcher plants, and they're suffering extreme pressure from woody encroachment, and the company holding the easement has not been able to get the staff on the ground to keep it pushed back. They are very good with fire, and so that's made a huge difference and working in tandem. So they're definitely participating in mechanical clearing, but we are doing our best to help them out. And in some of these other spots, like residential neighborhoods or on roadsides, is where the plants exist, and you got to go where they are. So this is another species we work with during the same work week we do every year. The giant whorled sunflower is restricted to roadsides at two populations in Alabama. And so up there on the edge of the road, there was quite a few stems, and this was solid thicket, what you're looking at here. But through years of cutting back, opening the canopy, getting grasses in there to hold the soil and keep everything happy and healthy, we've managed to make a good spot that the seeds have naturally moved back into and established on the interior of this property instead of on the roadside where there's constant threat of spraying, mowing, road expansion, any number of things. Okay, let's glance at Marshall County. So this is on Sand Mountain. We've been able to make some major improvements on some of these habitats. So you can see that was a sweet gum thicket up there with the marker tree in the center, where we've pushed it back over the last few years. And this year we were able to do our first entry fire. So you can see the difference we've made in just 4 years of work on this site has been wonderful. And the flowering response from the pitcher plants has been fantastic. We have observed recruitment at this site prior to the fire even. So again, and this is where that site was. The This is where this pile was from that site in Marshall County. And when you have sweet gums that thick, there's no chance of grass growing underneath them, much less pitcher plants. But the rhizomes of the pitcher plants are very tough and they persisted in the little bit of clearing that was in the middle. But now you can see where those sweet gums were. We've been able to encourage grass. We actually did plant some plugs from a nearby field into this bog. And the hard to make that fire move. The damp leaves of water oaks and sweet gums are not going to carry a fire the way grasses will. And a nearby property also in Marshall County. And so you can see how these volunteers, they just go through like beavers. We got our brush cutter on the left there is basically a weed eater with a saw blade on it. And so one of us will go ahead and swing that around, getting enough of a path that a chainsaw can come behind that and take down the larger woody stems. And then the volunteers will drag in between those phases. And so you can see on the right where we've worked that day and on the left where we haven't gotten to. And so there is a record here for population, and we found the pins. They are on the same property, but not in this area. The flagging where they were and the PVC wells for monitoring the bog are still there. So hopefully we can open this up. Maybe some plants will just pop up in the sun. If not, we do have plants on the property that we could collect seed from, grow out, and reintroduce. Another way that we work is when the plants are in seed on site. Again, it's better if the plants never leave the property, seeds never leave the property. So we will just take a seed pod, go to the appropriate habitat that we've been managing, scuff up the ground, find some sphagnum moss, and direct sow some seed into the property to let them try to grow as naturally as possible on the site. And so here's some before and afters working through one of those Marshall County populations. And so this is where we do have plants on that property we were looking at on that last slide. And so looks like I've come in 5 minutes early. I hope you guys have some questions we can fill the time with. This is, of course, Splinter Hill Bog in South Alabama, one of the greatest botanical treasures in the world. And after a good burn when the white tops flesh out, it is truly inspirational. And so our goal is to work as hard as we can to get some of these bogs in North Alabama looking the way they do in South Alabama. So, how's the chat going, Kenny? You got anything in there for me?
Uh, no. Hear me?
Hmm. All right, so I see one where the question is the control burns are used to give the pitcher plants as much sunlight as possible. And so the answer to that is almost as much sunlight as possible. And so on the edges of the bog, we try to maintain an ecotonal gradient where there is more light that allows for the grasses to move in. And then the pitcher plants are what we're managing for, but we have to manage for the entire community at once. So if we were just to go in and cut down 100 trees at once instead of 10 trees for 10 years, then we run the risk of having other advantageous things like blackberries and uh, poison ivy move in and take advantage of the opened up habitat. So we want to give the associate species room to establish, and then the pitcher plants move in next. So kind of a slow gradient.
Can you hear me now, Patrick?
Oh, I can hear you now, Kenny. There we go.
Okay, perfect.
Sorry,
And
I
and an
still,
eco and an ecotone is a transitional period between like two ecosystems.
that's right. So we've got the woodlands that were there previously, and then the grasslands that we're trying to establish. And then, yeah, it's that margin in between.
Where most biodiversity occurs.
That's right. That's right. So we don't want to get rid of that. We just want it to move further away.
Elizabeth says, thanks. Dave Crosby says, this was an incredible and informative presentation.
Thanks, Dave.
The the person who asked about why you do the control burns, they also said, are pitchers the only species of carnivorous plants in Alabama?
Oh, goodness, no. We we have four genera of carnivorous plants in Alabama. So the bladderworts, utricularia, occur in every county. So that's our most widespread carnivorous species. And the Sarracenia in the south, north, and central parts of the state. Then the Droceras, the sundews occur statewide as well. And Pinguicula is restricted to the southern parts of the state, the butterworts.
Tyler Gramley says, how are you making first contact with owners of roadsides and private properties? What has been the most successful tool in reaching out to those people?
So we have an embarrassment of number of sites that need management. And so really we have so many spots that there's already relationships with the landowners that we're just basically following old connection points. And so the Nature Conservancy has been managing private properties for years, and they have helped us. Fish and Wildlife Service often accesses these properties. And so one of the reasons that we haven't worked in the parts of South Alabama is because there's, no federally endangered species there. But the groundwork was really already laid for a lot of these. And so what was missing was the informed managers. So the fish and wildlife people know of the plants. Some of the landowners know of the plants, but just having a trained workforce because the Nature Conservancy again is aware of so many places that it's a challenge for them to manage them all. And they're doing large scale fire management in Alabama is really one of their main focuses now. And so the Alabama Plant Conservation Alliance was able to fill in this need for managing small populations. And I know that doesn't help you much with an answer, but I think that there's definitely still sites that the landowners are already aware of. They're probably Fish and Wildlife and TNC are already aware of that, there's an avenue to go in and just say, hey, do you need help with this? And that's where the Plant Conservation Alliance meetings come in handy because you can talk through these things in a forum where people can weigh in.
Very good. Thank you so much, Patrick, for a great presentation. I'm excited to upload this to our ICPS YouTube page for everyone to watch. And thank you, everyone who attended this live. We have we like to do webinars 1 or 2 times a month. So if you go to our website, carnivorousplants.org, or to our Facebook page, you will see all of the upcoming presentations. The next one, which is happening in 2 weeks, is about carnivorous plants in Africa. And once again, thank you so much, Patrick.
You're welcome, Kenny. I appreciate you reaching out.
It's not a surprise that gardeners, educators, and scientists are fascinated by these unique plants. The International Carnivorous Plant Society, or ICPS, not only love these plants, but welcomes growers just getting started all the way through professional scientists. The ICPS even started an annual World Carnivorous Plant Day to celebrate them. The free online event is held the first Wednesday of May. Take a look around our website and you'll find historic documents about carnivorous plants, growing guides, free educational resources, and more. Have questions? Ask. We don't bite, but our plants do.